millions and millions of cars, as you know, Mercedes and BMW and Volkswagen and many others, and we were restricted from, essentially restricted from selling cars into the European Union, which is not nice.
A silent war is reshaping the automotive world, and your car keys are caught in the crossfire. When President Trump threatened 50% tariffs on European imports, German automakers didn't fold. They countered with shipping freezes, inventory stockpiles, and global production shifts. Luxury cars became weapons in a battle over sovereignty and identity. Now the key questions are, how will trade warfare hit your wallet? Why are NATO allies rewriting decades of cooperation through tariffs? And when German engineering collides with political games, will you still afford to drive it, or just watch it vanish from American roads? Stick around, the battle is already underway. The ultimatum that changed everything. Everything accelerated after May 23rd. Standing beneath the chandeliers of the East Room, President Donald Trump declared a policy that would send tremors through boardrooms in Berlin and Bavaria. 50% tariffs on all European Union auto imports unless production shifted to the United States, effective June 1st. No room for negotiation, no diplomatic cushion. The fallout was immediate. Shares of Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz fell by as much as 8%. These weren't paper losses, they were shockwaves. The automotive sector, already stretched thin by the existing 25% tariffs, was suddenly shoved into financial triage. A 50% tariff wouldn't just hurt, it would erase margins, force layoffs, and make European luxury vehicles unsellable in American showrooms. Consumers reacted too, though not all understood why. Surveys showed that nearly 1 in 5 shoppers rushed to close deals, fearing what June would bring. Meanwhile, Japanese brands enjoyed a bump as buyers pivoted to avoid the turmoil entirely. The European Union issued controlled but stern responses, hinting at retaliatory tariffs on bourbon, aviation parts, and American agriculture. Behind the scenes, German executives met with their government counterparts. They weren't pleading, they were planning. What unfolded wasn't just protectionism, it was a redrawing of the global trade map. What used to be commerce was now confrontation. But the German response wasn't rage, it was resolve. That resolve would take on many forms, all designed to survive the new battlefield, without ceding an inch of dignity or dominance. The German response machine. Faced with an existential threat, German automakers did not flinch. They mobilized. Audi, Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Volkswagen knew they couldn't abandon the American market, but they could rewrite how they operated within it. They responded not with protest, but with plans. Agile, aggressive, and aligned. Mercedes opted to absorb tariff costs temporarily, choosing to maintain prices in the short term to protect brand loyalty. BMW leaned into its American presence. Its South Carolina facility became a shield, running overtime to pump out models with U.S. origins and avoid the penalty altogether. Audi and Porsche, more dependent on imports, took divergent routes. Porsche accelerated shipping, while Audi pivoted production strategies internally. At the center of it all was a quiet but powerful consortium, the German Association of the Automotive Industry. Through back channels and private calls, industry leaders shared intelligence, negotiated tactics, and avoided cannibalizing one another's positions. This was not competition, it was coordination. Ingolstadt, Munich, Stuttgart all became war rooms. Engineers watched their design specs for American models rendered obsolete by politics. Maria Hoffman, a lead designer for the Q Series, saw years of market research discarded as tariff threats overrode customer preferences. For consumers, none of this was visible, only the effects. Inventory tightened, prices edged up, dealer incentives vanished. German cars remained, but they no longer arrived freely. The strategy was defensive, but not desperate. It was the industrial version of judo, turning the force of the blow into momentum for survival, the inventory gamble. Next came the question of timing and risk. Porsche made the boldest play. 5,000 vehicles were pushed to American shores before the deadline. Logistics became warfare. Cargo ships rerouted. Warehouses overstuffed. Dealerships scrambled for space and labor. Every delivery before June 1st was a financial win. Every delay a loss. Mercedes-Benz followed with a more controlled surge. In Alabama and New York, storage centers swelled. Logistics teams operated under blackout conditions to shield their efforts from market speculation. The gamble wasn't just about physical product, it was about psychological leverage. Dealers needed inventory to reassure customers. Executives needed inventory to sustain leverage in the negotiation standoff. Volkswagen, in contrast, halted specific models entirely. Lower-margin vehicles from Mexico were pulled from distribution to avoid unviable tariffs. It was triage: save what you can, abandon what you must. Inside American showrooms, the confusion mounted. Sales staff were caught between silence and speculation. Some were instructed to delay price hikes. Others were told to prepare for price shocks without warning customers until contracts were signed. Customers noticed. Trust eroded. The psychological impact mattered more than many executives anticipated. Luxury buyers aren't just purchasing cars. They're buying certainty, identity, continuity. When that fractures, so does demand. And yet the vehicles themselves, waiting in storage yards across the country, were more than metal. They were symbols of a once thriving trade partnership suspended in limbo. The outcome of this gamble would decide whether German engineering remained within reach for Americans, or faded behind tariff walls that neither diplomacy nor legacy could penetrate. We tracked shipping schedules, tariff deadlines, and inventory levels across brands to give you the exact timeline most buyers are missing. You now know when to act and when to wait while others make expensive mistakes. Subscribe. This timing advantage took weeks to research. Audi's freeze protocol. The luxury market collapse began with a whisper, a single line in a corporate memo from Ingolstadt that rewrote Audi's entire relationship with America. Executives met under the cold Bavarian dawn and emerged with a directive that stunned the industry. All shipments to the United States would be frozen, effective immediately. There was no slow drawdown, no phased exit, just silence. It was not surrender, it was leverage. Audi's 37,000 vehicles already in American inventory became both buffer and boundary. Unlike BMW, which had production in South Carolina, Audi's complete reliance on foreign assembly, both German and Mexican, meant it had no shield from tariffs. Selling those vehicles under new pricing rules would have torched profits. Withdrawing bought time. Sales staff in American showrooms found themselves adrift. Sarah Martinez in Denver went from closing deals to explaining indefinite delays. Customer relationships unraveled. Inventory vanished. Her income followed. Dealerships remained open, but floors were barren. Service bays stayed functional, but confidence evaporated. Yet for Audi, the pause was power. Rather than bleed under tariffs, the company preserved cash and dared consumers to consider what German excellence would cost without stable trade. The cultural risk was higher than the financial one. Audi's presence had grown over decades into a symbol of premium performance. Halting that flow risked more than money. It threatened loyalty. This wasn't hesitation. It was a strategic reset, and it placed the burden of consequence on everyone else. The Porsche front-load strategy. In Stuttgart, Porsche chose speed over silence. Rather than freeze or absorb losses, they acted. 5,000 vehicles were ordered into motion, transported across the Atlantic like contraband, trying to outrun a deadline. Their logic was cold. Every car arriving before June 1st escaped the tariffs. Every delay cost dearly. The shipping operation was immense. Cargo slots were negotiated at emergency premiums. Port clearances were expedited in Baltimore, Savannah, and New York. The 911, Cayenne, and Macan models were stuffed into freighters, stacked with surgical precision. Stuttgart's logistics teams barely slept. The American side scrambled to clear warehouse space in time. This was not overproduction, it was front-loaded control. Porsche dealers, used to lean inventory for exclusivity, suddenly had to sell fast. Buyers responded. Purchase cycles collapsed from months to days. Buyers who normally deliberated were now racing contracts. The urgency created an illusion of scarcity, and that illusion became sales. Porsche could afford the gamble. Their clientele, unlike Audi's, had cushion. A $10,000 spike on a $100,000 car could be absorbed. The margin could take a hit. What mattered was momentum. In crisis, momentum sells. It was chaos, but orchestrated. Porsche didn't just preserve access, they enhanced brand urgency. Inventory turned into pressure. Pressure turned into demand. Demand became their advantage. Meanwhile, Mercedes was preparing something very different, slower, deeper, and much more expensive. Mercedes' absorption strategy. Mercedes-Benz made its move in quiet defiance, not by freezing shipments or front-loading inventory, but by eating the cost. Every 2025 model shipped to the United States carried a hidden loss, absorbed by Stuttgart to preserve their place in the market. No consumer saw the tariff. No dealership raised prices. But inside the company, the financial burn was enormous. The reasoning was strategic. Mercedes sold 374,000 units in the United States the previous year. To raise prices suddenly would risk losing decades of brand loyalty. The decision: protect the relationship, sacrifice the quarter. Chief Financial Officer Harold Wilhelm laid out the math. Losing customers cost more in the long term than losing profit margin now. This wasn't sustainable forever, so Mercedes made cuts. Advertising budgets were slashed. Hiring freezes hit corporate offices. Even dealership support was trimmed. But they did not raise sticker prices, and that made them stand out. In Alabama, the domestic factory cushioned the blow. Vehicles partially assembled in the United States qualified for tariff exclusions. It became a lifeline, both symbolically and financially. Employees there realized they were now part of Mercedes' survival strategy. Dealers felt the shift immediately. Pricing held steady, customers stayed. In fact, some arrived specifically because Audi and Porsche felt riskier. Mercedes sold stability. And that stability, during trade chaos, became luxury's most valuable currency. While others zigged, Mercedes endured, quiet, battered, but unwavering. Then came BMW, with a strategy neither aggressive nor passive, but calculated to perfection. BMW's calculated pivot. BMW's playbook didn't open with panic, it opened with spreadsheets. In Munich, executives studied every segment, model, and geography. What emerged was not a headline-grabbing move, but a sequence of precise adjustments that allowed them to survive while everyone else strained. They raised prices, slightly, 4% on Mexican-built 2 Series models. The increase was just enough to preserve margins, not enough to chase away buyers. South Carolina's plant, their largest worldwide, became a cornerstone. Vehicles built there, like the X Series, qualified for tariff exemptions. That meant BMW could prioritize U.S. production for high-demand vehicles and soften import reliance without retreat. Dealers appreciated the clarity. Communications came early and were consistent. Customers were prepped. Price changes were gradual, inventory steady. This calmness became a draw. As Porsche flooded showrooms and Mercedes held prices unnaturally low, BMW walked the middle path, reliable, available, and still aspirational. Internally, the company ran scenario meetings daily. Tariff timelines, shipment delays, competitor shifts. Everything was tracked. It wasn't flashy, but it was resilient. BMW did not freeze. They did not overreach. They adapted without drama. In the American market, that approach built trust. The numbers reflected it. As other German brands scrambled, BMW's sales line dipped less sharply and stabilized faster. Their response wasn't emotional. It was engineered, as if the company built crisis plans with the same logic as their drivetrains, balanced, precise, and tested under pressure. The next phase would test just how far that precision could take them, because politics was not done reshaping the road ahead. Brussels strikes back. What began as defensive posturing in Brussels transformed into a fully coordinated campaign of economic retaliation. The European Union's €95 billion response package was not symbolic. It was designed to inflict maximum political damage. Behind closed doors, European trade officials targeted products tied to key American congressional districts, transforming diplomacy into electoral disruption. Kentucky bourbon was among the first targets. Brussels officials understood the political symbolism. Hitting the home state of Senator Mitch McConnell would not go unnoticed. European tariffs would not just hurt industries. They would embarrass the lawmakers who had cheered American protectionism. Motorcycle exports faced similar treatment. Harley-Davidson, a brand steeped in American identity, saw its access to the European market evaporate. Agricultural producers braced for impact. European buyers began quietly diversifying supply chains, eyeing South American grain, Canadian livestock, and Australian soybeans. American farming communities, still recovering from previous tariff shocks, faced the terrifying prospect of long-term market displacement. Aviation was next. European authorities hinted at regulatory actions that could restrict Boeing sales. The aerospace sector, long considered immune from political interference, suddenly found itself in a new battlefield. The July deadline for retaliatory measures loomed, creating urgency in Brussels and chaos in Washington. The message was clear. The European Union was done absorbing hits. American tariffs would now come with consequences that were no longer just economic. They were political, targeted, and personal. The German economic spine. Germany's economy wasn't simply exposed, it was entangled in the very trade structures under attack. The IFO Institute's projections were dire: a 2% economic contraction and systemic damage to one of Europe's most productive sectors. Tariff pressure wasn't just cutting into margins, it was threatening to undo decades of industrial reinvestment. Automotive exports worth over 60 billion euros annually became liabilities overnight. Oxford Economics estimated a 7.1% decline in exports to the American market, signaling that the damage would not be isolated to car companies. Precision engineering, chemicals, software, and logistics firms tethered to the auto sector braced for cascading disruption. Chancellor Olaf Scholz kept a calm public face, speaking of diplomacy and negotiation. Behind closed doors, communications with automotive executives revealed growing alarm. Economy Minister Robert Habeck was less reserved, declaring that Germany would not back down. The industrial engine of Europe was under siege. Communities built around automotive excellence, like Stuttgart and Wolfsburg, watched job security disintegrate. The automotive assembly line, once a symbol of German resurgence, now resembled a fault line splitting under external pressure. Layoffs became a looming inevitability. Factory output slowed. Banks prepared for credit defaults. Small suppliers lost contracts. The nation's identity, intertwined with industrial craftsmanship, was in crisis, and the German government knew it would take more than subsidies to rebuild what transatlantic trade might soon destroy. The Apple precedent. This wasn't just about cars. When Apple's stock dipped nearly 4% in a single day, it became clear that trade conflict had breached a new sector. If tariffs could corner German automakers, they could do the same to Silicon Valley. Apple's production model, deeply embedded in Chinese supply chains, was now a target. The political message from Washington was unambiguous: repatriate production or face tariff barriers. The threat extended beyond autos and reached the global electronic supply chain. Technology executives who once viewed trade wars as someone else's problem were suddenly strategizing emergency scenarios. Relocating production would take years and billions in capital expenditure. Apple's manufacturing network had taken decades to build, spread across suppliers in China, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Disrupting it for political compliance was not feasible without deep consumer price hikes and revenue shocks. The implications reverberated through the tech sector. Semiconductor firms, logistics networks, and consumer electronics producers scrambled to understand how much political risk their global footprints now carried. It was no longer just about operational efficiency. It was about political alignment. The auto industry was the test case. The tech industry was the next battlefield. And with energy, agriculture, and aerospace already under pressure, there were few sectors left that could assume they were immune. Political compliance had become a cost of doing business. The NATO economic risk. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization had weathered wars, nuclear threats, and decades of ideological confrontation, but car tariffs were now threatening to unravel its most important glue: economic interdependence. The alliance was built not just on defense commitments, but on mutual prosperity. That bond was weakening. Trade disruption between America and Europe jeopardized the joint defense projects that relied on shared industrial capacity. American and European contractors co-produced aircraft, cybersecurity tools, and munitions. Now those pipelines risked fragmentation. A tariff war risked becoming a technology split, undermining NATO's ability to function as a unified force. The conflict in Ukraine made the threat more dangerous. Alliance coordination was critical for long-term arms deliveries and defense budget planning. Economic conflict between the two largest NATO economies disrupted the funding and procurement timelines vital for military assistance. Germany and France expressed concern over the economic breakdown, fearing that defense readiness would suffer. At the Pentagon, internal memos began assessing what delays in European manufacturing could mean for American force deployment. Even routine cooperation, troop movements, joint exercises, base logistics relied on agreements that were now clouded by broader mistrust. European leaders worried aloud that economic nationalism in Washington could eventually be mirrored in military disengagement. The stakes were no longer just trade balances or corporate earnings. NATO's cohesion now depended on economic diplomacy, succeeding where tariffs had failed. If it didn't, the next shock to the alliance might not come from Moscow, but from the collapse of the transatlantic marketplace it once took for granted. The inventory countdown. How long can luxury survive when supply chains become weapons of war and every premium vehicle in America becomes a countdown timer measuring the final moments of affordable German engineering? The answer was hiding in plain sight across dealership lots where 37,000 Audi vehicles represented the last remnants of a trade relationship that had defined automotive luxury for generations. The mathematics were brutally simple. 2 months of Audi inventory meant 60 days before empty showrooms confronted American buyers with the stark reality of political economics. Each day that passed without resolution brought German luxury closer to complete unavailability for middle-class consumers who had saved for years to afford engineering excellence. Cox Automotive's predictions painted a terrifying picture for American consumers. 10 to 15% price increases for tariff-affected vehicles meant that $50,000 cars would become $57,000 purchases overnight. The middle-class accessibility that had democratized German luxury faced systematic destruction through political interference. Jennifer Walsh, who had spent 8 months configuring her perfect A4, watched her dream car transform from accessible luxury into potential unavailability. The emotional investment in German engineering suddenly faced political reality that no amount of money could overcome. The countdown created artificial scarcity that transformed luxury car purchasing from careful consideration into panic buying. Wealthy Americans who might normally spend months evaluating options found themselves making immediate decisions based on availability rather than preference, fundamentally altering the psychology of premium automotive consumption. Insurance companies began adjusting coverage calculations as German vehicles appreciated beyond original purchase prices simply through scarcity. The artificial value inflation created by political supply disruption meant that luxury cars became inadvertent investment vehicles for owners lucky enough to purchase before the crisis. Now, the entire luxury automotive ecosystem faced a countdown that would redefine accessibility forever. But the human cost was becoming visible in dealership communities where families had built businesses around relationships that political decisions were systematically destroying. Dealership survival mode. Your local luxury car dealer just became ground zero for the biggest trade war in modern history, where family businesses built over decades faced extinction through supply disruption that no amount of customer service excellence could overcome. Jim Rodriguez owned BMW and Mercedes franchises in Phoenix that had taken 23 years to build into thriving community institutions. His relationships with customers spanned generations as families returned for vehicle after vehicle, trusting his expertise and service commitment. Political decisions made in distant capitals threatened to destroy everything he had created. Marketing budgets evaporated overnight as luxury automakers redirected resources toward crisis management rather than consumer attraction. Television advertisements disappeared, promotional events canceled, and community sponsorships ended as companies abandoned growth strategies for survival tactics. The employment implications were devastating for communities built around automotive retail. Luxury car dealerships employed thousands of Americans in sales, service, and administrative roles that depended on consistent inventory flow and customer traffic. Maria Santos, a Mercedes sales consultant in Atlanta, found herself apologizing for corporate decisions she couldn't influence while watching commission income disappear through inventory evaporation. Customer relationships that had taken years to develop faced destruction through circumstances beyond dealer control. New hire freezes extended across luxury automotive retail as dealership owners calculated reduced staffing needs for diminished inventory levels. Young Americans seeking automotive careers found entry-level opportunities disappearing just as their interest in the industry peaked. The dealership network had become a casualty of economic warfare. But across America, luxury car buyers were discovering that their next purchase had become a political statement that would define their relationship with German engineering permanently. The consumer price reality. In just 24 hours, your dream car became $10,000 more expensive. And that was just the beginning of a pricing transformation that would redefine what it meant to own German luxury in America. The mathematics were devastating for American families who had saved for German luxury vehicles. A $50,000 BMW became a $57,500 investment under Cox Automotive's conservative 10 to 15% increase projections. The $7,500 difference represented months of additional saving for middle-class buyers. Porsche lease payments faced $10,000 annual increases that would price out the professional class buyers who had sustained luxury automotive growth through accessible financing options. The monthly payment shock meant that vehicles once attainable through lease structures became exclusive to cash buyers wealthy enough to absorb political pricing premiums. Sarah Kim, a Seattle software engineer who had saved 3 years for her first BMW, watched her target vehicle become financially impossible despite salary increases and diligent budget management. Young professionals who had aspired to German luxury found their dreams priced beyond reach through political decisions they couldn't influence. The Auto Pacific survey, revealing 18% of shoppers were motivated by tariff concerns, demonstrated how political interference was reshaping consumer behavior. American buyers found themselves making automotive decisions based on trade policy rather than vehicle preference. Alternative luxury brands began capturing displaced German luxury buyers as Lexus, Acura, and Infiniti dealerships reported increased traffic from consumers seeking premium experiences without tariff-inflated pricing. The market disruption was redistributing luxury automotive preferences along political rather than performance lines. The numbers revealed something economists hadn't predicted. This wasn't just about cars anymore, it was about reshaping who could afford what. But the most fundamental transformation was yet to come, as German automakers faced the ultimate survival decision, the production relocation decision. The survival of German luxury in America now depended on a choice no executive wanted to make: abandon the manufacturing heritage that had defined their brands for over a century, or watch American market access disappear forever through political interference. Audi and Porsche executives found themselves exploring American production for the first time in their corporate histories, driven by necessity rather than strategic choice. The companies that had built global reputations on German engineering precision confronted the prospect of diluting brand identity to preserve market access through political compliance. The production relocation calculations were staggering in complexity and cost. Establishing American manufacturing facilities required billions in capital investment, years of construction timeline, and workforce development that couldn't replicate German engineering culture overnight. BMW's South Carolina facility provided the template for German automotive survival in America. But scaling this model across multiple brands and vehicle segments required infrastructure investment that would strain corporate resources, while political tariff policy remained unpredictable. The cultural implications were profound for companies whose identities were inseparable from German engineering heritage. Porsche vehicles manufactured in American facilities would challenge brand authenticity in ways that marketing campaigns couldn't resolve. American communities began competing for German manufacturing investment, as state and local governments offered incentives to attract automotive production that would provide employment and economic development. The irony wasn't lost on officials who recognized that American tariff policy was forcing German companies to consider investments they had never previously contemplated. The timeline pressures were intense as 50% tariff thresholds approached, while production facility development required multi-year construct and workforce training schedules. German automakers faced impossible choices between immediate market abandonment and long-term manufacturing commitments. So, what do you think? Will German luxury brands adapt and survive? Or are we watching the quiet collapse of an entire era? Are tariffs rewriting the future of high-end automobiles in America? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for what happens next.